She ran from a sickness that had no name. It was a phantom that lived in her blood, a cold whisper in the marrow of her bones, a legacy of fading light passed down from mother to daughter for generations uncounted. In the final days, it had become a physical thing, a shadow that clung to the corners of her vision, a hunter made of despair. It drove her from her village, from the accusing eyes and the whispers of witch blood that followed her like a shroud. It drove her through forgotten forests and over jagged hills, her lungs burning, her feet bleeding, until she stood before the impossible. A citadel of black stone that clawed at the bruised twilight sky. The obsidian court, a place of myth, a place of monsters. The shadow sickness screamed at her to turn back. It recoiled from the ancient power radiating from the stone, a power as cold and absolute as a winter grave. But another instinct, deeper and more desperate, pulled her forward. It was a song beneath the skin, a single note of resonance that promised either sanctuary or a swift end. Both seemed a mercy. She found no gate, no door, only a seamless wall of polished basalt that drank the starlight. She pressed her trembling hands against its surface, a sob catching in her throat. The stone was not cold. It was frigid, leaching the last of her warmth. But as her palm flattened against it, a sigil flared to life beneath her skin, a mirror of the faint, spiraling birthmark on her wrist. The wall dissolved into shimmering black dust before her, revealing a cavernous hall beyond. An invitation, a trap. She stumbled inside, and the gateway sealed behind her with the sound of a final breath. The air was thick with the scent of old stone, cold metal, and something else, something metallic and sweet, like wine and blood. The hall was a study in obsidian and silver. Towering pillars of black rock held up a vaulted ceiling where crystals glittered like captive stars. A long, dark table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by figures of unnerving stillness and lethal grace. Their eyes, ranging in color from molten gold to chips of ice, all turned to her. They were beautiful. They were ancient. They were predators. And she was the small, terrified thing that had wandered into their den. 100 pairs of inhuman eyes fixed on her. The silence was a physical weight pressing down, suffocating. Whispers slithered through the air, sharp as shivs. Human, unclean. How did she pass the wards? Kill it. The voices were not sound but thought, invasive and cruel, stabbing directly into her mind. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but the sickness she fled was a greater terror. She had run from a slow death into the promise of a quick one. Her gaze swept past the hostile faces, past the glint of fangs in the candlelight, and found the heart of the room. A throne, carved from a single massive piece of obsidian, sat upon a raised dais, and on it, a figure slumped, almost lost in the shadows. He was not like the others. While they radiated a predatory vitality, he was a portrait of decay. His skin was pale as ash, stretched taut over sharp cheekbones. His black hair was lank, his fine clothes hanging loose on a skeletal frame. His eyes were closed, and his stillness was not one of patience, but of profound, unending exhaustion. A dying prince on a throne of darkness. The instinct that had dragged her here flared into a command. It was not a thought. It was a physical pull, a current in her blood that flowed toward him. She ignored the rising snarls of the court. She ignored the guards who tensed, their hands moving to the hilts of silvered swords. She took one step, then another, her ragged breathing the only sound in the vast, silent chamber. Her focus narrowed until only the man on the throne existed. He was the source of the song, the single note her soul had been seeking. This was the place the sickness had driven her, the end of her desperate flight. A lord of this ageless court, yet he was afflicted by a blight that felt unervingly familiar. It was a mirror of her own inherited curse, but 1,000 times older, 1,000 times more potent. A decay of the spirit that had finally begun to claim the flesh. She reached the foot of the dais. 2 guards, their faces masks of cold fury, moved to block her path. Their eyes glowed with a faint, red light. "No closer, human." One of them hissed, the words vibrating with contained violence. Elara did not hear him. The pull was overwhelming now, a fire in her veins. She looked past the guards, her gaze fixed on the prince's still face. A plea tore from her throat, raw and broken, addressed not to the court, but to him alone. "Please," she whispered, the sound swallowed by the immense silence. "Help me." It was not a plea for sanctuary. It was a plea for an end. She had come here to die, to offer her life to the monsters of legend if they would only grant her oblivion from the curse that hunted her. But as she spoke, her hand lifted, an unconscious gesture of supplication. Her fingers, dirty and trembling, extended toward him. The guards moved to seize her, but they were too slow. Some force, born of her desperation and the strange resonance between them, propelled her forward. Her fingertips brushed against the cold, still back of his hand where it rested on the arm of the throne. And the world exploded into silent light. A shockwave of pure energy, invisible and soundless, erupted from the point of contact. The crystal goblets on the long table shattered. The candles guttered and died, plunging the hall into near darkness, lit only by the faint, cosmic glow of the ceiling crystals. The vampires of the court cried out, shielding their sensitive eyes, recoiling from a power they had not felt in centuries. It was raw. It was ancient. It was life. On the throne, the prince's head snapped up. His eyes, closed for what seemed an eternity, flew open. They were the color of a winter storm, silver gray and filled with a sudden, shocking clarity. A breath shuddered through his chest, the first true breath he had drawn in a decade. A flicker of warmth, faint as a dying ember, spread from her touch, pushing back the ice that had filled his veins for so long. He stared at her, not with confusion, but with a dawning, impossible recognition. The entire hall went silent. The shock was absolute. The whispers ceased, replaced by a stunned, collective awe that was quickly curdling into suspicion. They stared at the human girl, this frail, pathetic creature who had breached their impenetrable fortress. This girl who had touched their dying lord and made him stir. Unthinkable, unprecedented. A tall, severe-looking vampire with silver hair and eyes like chips of obsidian stepped forward. His name was Valerius, and his voice was a blade wrapped in silk. "What is this sorcery?" he demanded, his gaze flicking from Elara to his prince. "She is an assassin. She poisoned him." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the court. Fear was a potent catalyst for paranoia. They saw not a miracle but an attack. A new form of witchery sent to finish what had begun centuries ago. Several nobles drew their blades, the scrape of steel against scabbard echoing in the tense silence. Seraphina, the captain of the guard, placed a hand on her own sword, her expression grim, her loyalty to her prince warring with the primal instinct to eliminate a clear threat. But the Prince Cassian raised a hand. A simple gesture, but it carried the weight of 1,000 years of command. The court froze. His storm-gray eyes never left Elara's face. The flicker of life she had given him was already fading, the ancient cold seeping back in, but the memory of it was a firebrand in his mind. He had felt the signature of her magic. He knew it. He knew it as he knew the curse that was killing him. They were two sides of the same blighted coin. His voice, when it came, was a dry rasp, the sound of stone grinding against stone. It was a voice that had not been used in years, but it held an unbreakable core of authority. "She is unharmed," he commanded. The words were a thunderclap in the silence. Valerius took another step forward, his handsome face a mask of disbelief and outrage. "My lord, she is a human witch. She bears the mark of our enemy. She must be destroyed before her poison spreads." He pointed a long, elegant finger at Elara's wrist, where the faint, spiraling mark was now glowing with a soft, silver light. The court vampires stirred, their fear and hatred stoked by Valerius's words. The mark was undeniable. It was the sigil of Elara, the witch who had laid the curse of slow decay upon their royal line 5 centuries ago, a curse of betrayal born from a broken oath. To see it on this human girl, here in their sacred hall, was the deepest sacrilege. It was a declaration of war. "She is the curse made flesh," another noble shouted. "To protect her is to embrace our own doom." Cassian's gaze remained locked on Elara. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw the same exhaustion that had haunted him for centuries. She was not a warrior. She was a victim, a descendant burdened with a power and a legacy she did not understand. A legacy that was, impossibly, the only key to his survival. That single, fleeting touch had done more to combat his affliction than all the blood rituals and ancient magics his court had attempted for 100 years. He pushed himself up from the throne. The movement was slow, agonizing. Every joint screamed in protest. The effort cost him dearly, the fragile warmth she had gifted him almost entirely consumed by the action. But he stood. For the first time in 5 years, Lord Cassian, Prince of the Obsidian Court, stood on his own 2 feet. A collective gasp swept the chamber. Even Valerius was momentarily silenced, his eyes wide with shock. They had grown accustomed to their withering prince, a relic bound to his throne. To see him standing, however shakily, was to see a ghost rise from its grave. Cassian took a deliberate step toward Elara, placing himself between her and his volatile court. His voice was stronger now, laced with an icy finality that permitted no argument. "She is under my protection," he declared. "She will be housed in my chambers. She will not be questioned. She will not be touched." He swept his gaze over the stunned faces of his subjects, his eyes lingering on Valerius with a clear, cold warning. "This is my decree. Those who defy it will answer to me." The threat was implicit, but its power was absolute. He was weakened, a shadow of his former self, but he was still their prince. His word was law, a law forged in blood and time. Valerius's lips thinned into a venomous line, but he gave a shallow, mocking bow. "As you command, my prince." His tone implied that the command was the babbling of a dying, desperate man. He retreated, melting back into the ranks of the court, but his obsidian eyes promised dissent. He would obey the letter of the law, for now, but the spirit of rebellion had been ignited. Seraphina, the captain of the guard, was the first to act on the decree. Her expression was a mixture of deep suspicion and unwavering duty. She sheathed her sword and approached Elara, her movements economical and precise. "Come, human," she said, her voice low and devoid of warmth. "The prince has spoken." She gestured for Elara to follow, her hand resting near the hilt of her weapon, a clear sign that this was not an invitation, but a command. Elara, still trembling from the surge of energy and the court's naked hostility, could only nod. The connection to the prince, that strange, life-affirming current, was gone, leaving her feeling hollowed out and colder than before. She had come here expecting a swift death and had instead been claimed by the very monster she assumed would kill her. She followed Seraphina away from the throne, acutely aware of 100 pairs of hateful eyes tracking her every step. As she passed the dais, her gaze met Cassian's. For a fleeting second, in the stormy gray of his eyes, she saw not the cold command of a vampire lord, but a flicker of something else. Something that looked terrifyingly like hope. Cassian watched her go, the strength that had surged through him guttering like a spent candle. He sank back onto his throne, the effort of standing and speaking having cost him almost everything. The cold returned with a vengeance, a familiar, creeping paralysis that stole the breath from his lungs and turned his limbs to lead. But it was different now. The despair that had been his constant companion for a century was gone, replaced by a fragile, burning coal of possibility. Her touch. He could still feel the phantom echo of it on his skin, a spark of life in a world of dust and shadows. She was the descendant of his greatest enemy, a living embodiment of the curse that was destroying him, and she was his only chance. The irony was a blade twisting in his gut. Seraphina led Elara through winding corridors of polished black stone, the silence broken only by the faint echo of their footsteps. The air grew colder, the oppressive weight of ancient magic deepening with every step. Elara hugged herself, the thin fabric of her dress offering no protection against the chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. She was in the heart of the beast's lair, a lamb being led to a private slaughter. The prince's protection felt less like a shield and more like the act of a predator claiming its meal for later. They arrived before a pair of immense doors carved from petrified wood, inlaid with veins of raw silver that pulsed with a faint, magical light. Serafina pushed them open without a word, revealing the prince's private chambers. The room was vast and Spartan. A massive, unlit fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel bare. A large bed, draped in dark, heavy fabrics, occupied another. The only other furniture was a simple wooden table and 2 chairs. But it was the far wall that stole Elara's breath. It was made entirely of enchanted crystal, a seamless window that looked out not upon a night sky, but upon a swirling nebula of stars and cosmic dust. It was a view of eternity, beautiful and terrifyingly lonely. "You will remain here," Serafina stated, her voice flat. "Food and water will be brought. Do not attempt to leave. The wards in this chamber are tied to the prince himself. To try and breach them would be unwise." The threat hung in the air, sharp and clear. Serafina's gaze lingered on Elara for a moment, a flicker of something, curiosity, perhaps, or contempt, in her crimson eyes. Then, without another word, she turned and left, the heavy doors closing behind her with a sound of utter finality. Elara was alone. She stood in the center of the immense, cold room, feeling smaller and more lost than ever before. The view from the crystal wall was mesmerizing, but it offered no comfort. It was the view from a cage, a gilded prison at the heart of a cursed kingdom. She wrapped her arms around herself, the phantom sickness in her blood stirring again. It had been quiet since she entered the citadel, cowed by the overwhelming power here, but now it whispered its old, familiar fears into her mind. She had not escaped it. She had only brought it into a new, more dangerous place. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the fine silk feeling alien against her skin, and stared into the star-dusted abyss, wondering what kind of doom she had just sealed for herself. Hours later, Cassian sat in the echoing silence of his throne room, the court having long since dispersed into resentful whispers and conspiratorial shadows. He was alone with his thoughts, a state he had endured for decades. Yet tonight it felt different. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the memory of her touch. He held his hand up to the faint light of the ceiling crystals, half expecting to see a mark on his ashen skin where she had made contact. There was nothing, of course. The change was internal, a subtle shift in the balance of his long, stagnant war against the curse. He closed his eyes, allowing his mind to drift back through the centuries, a painful pilgrimage he rarely undertook. He saw the face of Lyra, Elara's ancestor. She had not been a monster. She had been a powerful wielder of life magic, a keeper of oaths, and an ally to his bloodline. Her eyes had been the same shade of frightened brown as the girl's. The alliance between their kinds was ancient, a pact of mutual protection. His ancestor was meant to shield her people. She was meant to use her magic to keep the land vital, which in turn nourished the blood his people consumed. Perfect symbiosis. The memory shifted, sharpening with the clarity of remembered pain. He saw his great-grandfather, Lord Theron, making an oath to Lyra, an oath to protect her bloodline, to be a shield against the rising tide of human persecution. And then the betrayal. Theron, in a fit of paranoid pride, had stood aside as witch hunters burned Lyra's village. He had honored the letter of their pact. He had not harmed them himself, but he had shattered its spirit. He had broken his oath. Lyra had not died in the flames. She had survived. Her heart turned to ash and her magic twisted by grief into a weapon of terrible, patient vengeance. Her curse was not one of swift death. It was a masterpiece of poetic justice. As his bloodline had allowed her people to wither and die, so too would his bloodline wither. A slow, grinding decay of the spirit that would pass from father to son, growing stronger with each generation, until it finally snuffed them out. A blight that leached vitality, hope, and finally, life itself. For 500 years it had done its work. And he, Cassian, was the last of his line. He was its final, dying breath. A bitter smile touched his lips. His court believed the curse was born of a witch's spite. They had forgotten the truth or chosen to forget it. The shame of a broken oath was a greater wound than any curse. But he had not forgotten. The knowledge of his ancestors' dishonor was a stone in his gut, a burden he carried along with the curse itself. It was his deepest secret, the source of his isolation. He could not lead a people who did not understand the nature of their own damnation. He could not rule from a throne of lies. And now this girl, Elara, a descendant of the very woman his family had betrayed. Her magic, the same life-giving energy Lyra had once used to nurture the land, was the only thing that had ever pushed back against the decay. Her presence was both the poison and the antidote. The curse, sensing its origin, had drawn her here, and in its malevolence it had made a fatal error. It had brought the key to its own undoing directly to his door. The hope he felt was a fragile, dangerous thing. It hurt. After a century of numb resignation, the sharp sting of hope was an agony. It demanded action. It demanded strength he no longer possessed. But as he sat there, feeling the last of her gifted warmth fade, he made a new oath, a silent vow to the echoing dark. He would not let her be consumed by the court's fear. He would not allow her to become a sacrifice to their ignorance. He had inherited his ancestors' curse. He would not inherit his ancestors' dishonor. This time, the oath to Lyra's bloodline would be kept. The heavy doors to his chambers opened, and Elara flinched, scrambling back on the bed. It was Cassian. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed to cause him immense pain. He did not look at her, instead making his way to the table where a silver tray had been left. It held a crystal goblet filled with the dark, crimson liquid she had smelled in the throne room. Blood. He picked up the goblet, his hand trembling slightly with the effort. He took a slow, measured sip, his eyes closed. A faint trace of color returned to his ashen cheeks. It was not healing. It was sustenance, a temporary stay against the inevitable decay. He set the goblet down and finally turned his gaze to her. His storm-gray eyes were ancient, filled with a weariness that transcended time. "You are the daughter of Lyra's line," he said. It was not a question. His voice was still a rasp, but it held a quiet certainty. Elara stared at him, confused and afraid. I don't know who that is. My mother's name was Isolde." "A name is a leaf on a branch of a very old tree," Cassian replied, his gaze distant. "Your blood remembers what your mind has forgotten. The mark on your wrist. It is her mark." She glanced down at the faint spiral, which was no longer glowing. It was just a pale pattern against her skin, a thing she had had her entire life. "It's just a birthmark." "It is a key," he corrected softly. "And the curse that is killing me is the lock." He took a hesitant step closer, his eyes fixed on her. "When you touched me, I felt it. Life. A memory of what I have lost. Fear warred with a strange, burgeoning curiosity." This terrifying creature was not threatening her. He was explaining. He was vulnerable. The sickness she had carried her whole life, the phantom that had haunted her family, was connected to this dying prince and his ancient curse. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Cassian's expression was bleak. "I want to live," he said, the admission costing him a visible measure of his pride. "And I believe you are the only one who can help me." He stopped a few feet from the bed, making no move to come closer, granting her space. "Your ancestor cursed my line for a broken promise. Your touch, it seems to be a reminder of that promise." A countermelody to the song of decay, an impossible truth began to dawn on her. The sickness in her family was not a sickness at all. It was a power, dormant and misunderstood, a fading echo of an ancient magic. It was the other half of his curse. "I don't know how," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know anything about magic." "You do not need to know," he said, his gaze intense. "You only need to be." He hesitated, then extended his hand, palm up. An offering, a request. Please, let me feel it again. Just for a moment her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to stay away, that touching him was madness. But she saw the desperation in his eyes, the same desperation that had driven her to his gates. They were two sides of a cursed coin, bound together by a centuries-old betrayal. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out. Her fingers were trembling so hard she could barely control them. She laid her hand in his. His skin was cold as marble. But the moment they made contact, the spark ignited again. It was stronger this time, a gentle, flowing warmth that passed from her into him. It was not her energy being drained. It was more like she was a conduit, channeling a forgotten power from the world itself. A memory flashed behind her eyes, sharp and vivid. A sunlit glade. A woman with her own face and fiery hair, laughing. A tall, handsome man with Cassian's storm-gray eyes, smiling as he swore an oath on his sword. The vision was gone as quickly as it came, leaving her breathless. Cassian gasped, a sharp intake of breath. The lines of pain on his face softened. The tremor in his hand stilled. He looked down at their joined hands, a look of profound wonder on his face. He could feel the curse receding, not gone, but retreating like a tide from the shore, cowed by this influx of pure life. "It is true," he breathed. He looked up at her, and for the first time, his eyes held no coldness, only a raw, unguarded gratitude. "You are the key." The days that followed settled into a strange, tense routine. Elara remained confined to Cassian's chambers, a prisoner granted the most luxurious cell in the citadel. Serafina brought her meals, her face an unreadable mask of stoicism, though Elara began to notice the captain's eyes lingering on her with a grudging curiosity rather than pure contempt. The rest of the court remained a hostile, unseen presence, their resentment a palpable force that seemed to seep through the stone walls. Cassian visited her each evening. He would enter, weakened and gray from a day spent fighting back the encroaching decay, and she would give him her hand. The process became a silent ritual. Each time she touched him, the warmth flowed more easily, the visions of the past growing clearer, longer. She saw glimpses of the alliance, the shared magic, the deep respect between their ancestors. And she saw the betrayal, the fire, the heartbreak that had twisted Lyra's life-giving power into a weapon of slow, agonizing revenge. She was learning her own history through his curse. With each touch, Cassian grew stronger. The ashen pallor of his skin was replaced by a healthier, though still pale, complexion. He began to move with his old predatory grace, the pain receding from his eyes. He started to speak more, sharing stories of his long life, of the world before the curse, of the heavy burden of his crown. A fragile, tentative trust began to form between them in the quiet solitude of his chambers, a bond forged in shared affliction and a desperate, mutual need. But as Cassian healed, the citadel itself began to sicken. The presence of Lyra's heir, the conduit for a power so long absent, was agitating the ancient curse. Dark, oily ichor began to weep from the joints in the stonework. Shadows in the corridors seemed to deepen and writhe with a life of their own. A perpetual, unnatural chill descended upon the lower halls, and the tempers of the court vampires, already frayed, grew shorter and more violent. Valerius seized upon the growing fear. He moved through the court like a phantom, his whispers poisoning the minds of the nobles. "Do you see?" he would murmur in the torchlit darkness. "The human is not healing him. She is a parasite, accelerating the curse's final stage. She concentrates its power, preparing to consume him and this entire court." He painted a picture of Elara as a willing agent of their destruction, a witch sent to finish her ancestors' work. He twisted Cassian's recovery into a symptom of a deeper sickness, a final burst of feverish energy before the end. His words found fertile ground in the vampire's ancient paranoia. They saw the weeping walls and the grasping shadows and believed him. They saw their prince sequestered with a human witch, and they saw not a strategy for survival, but the madness of a desperate, dying man. The dissent grew from whispers to open murmurs of rebellion. The court was a powder keg, and Valerius held the match. The confrontation came not from Valerius, but from a more measured opponent. Lord Malachi, Cassian's oldest advisor, a vampire whose loyalty was to the stability of the court above all else, requested an audience. He found Cassian standing before the star-dusted window in his chambers, Elara sitting quietly on the bed behind him. Cassian looked more vital than he had in a century, a fact that seemed to disturb the old advisor more than reassure him. "My prince," Malachi began, his voice a low, troubled rumble. "The court is afraid. The citadel weakens. The curse, it grows more active. They believe the human is the cause. The human is the cure," Cassian countered, not turning from the window. "The curse is fighting back. It is the thrashing of a dying beast." Malachi shook his head, his ancient face etched with worry. "Perhaps, or perhaps it is the coiling of a serpent before it strikes. Valerius is using this fear. He speaks of deposing you for the good of the court. He suggests that a sacrifice is needed to appease the curse, that her blood, spilled upon the throne, would purify us." Elara went cold. She had known they hated her, but to hear of their murderous plans so plainly spoken was terrifying. Cassian finally turned, his eyes like chips of ice. "Valerius has always been ambitious. His greed wears the mask of pragmatism, but his words resonate with the fearful." Malachi pressed, taking a step closer. "And right now all of them are fearful. My prince, they are your people. You are asking them to trust a process they cannot see, to embrace the descendant of our greatest enemy. Offer them a compromise. Give the girl to the council. Let us place her in the lower cells, warded and contained. It would show the court you are taking the threat seriously. It would placate Valerius's faction and buy us time." He was offering her up as a political pawn, a merciful solution that was nothing more than a delayed execution. Before Cassian could answer, Elara stood up. Her voice trembled, but it was clear and firm. No, both vampires turned to look at her, surprised by her interjection. "I am not a piece in your political games, Lord Malachi," she said, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "And I am not a threat." She looked at Cassian, her gaze unwavering. "The curse is not just his. It is mine too. It has haunted my family for as long as it has haunted his. My place is here with him. Hiding me away will not stop the curse. It will only doom him." Malachi stared at her, taken aback by her defiance. He saw not a frightened human girl, but a woman with a will of iron. He looked at his prince and saw the undisguised respect in Cassian's eyes as he watched her. The bond between them was more than just symbiotic need. It was a genuine allegiance. "The girl has spoken," Cassian said, his voice quiet but absolute. "And she is right. We will face this together, out in the open. My decree stands. She is under my protection. Tell the court that. And tell them their prince is stronger than he has been in 100 years. If Valerius wishes to challenge my rule, he should do so to my face." Malachi held his prince's gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow, deep bow. "As you command, my lord." He turned and left the chambers, his mind in turmoil. He had come to challenge his prince's judgment, but left with a renewed sense of his authority. The prince was not mad. He was fighting, and the human girl was not his weakness, but his weapon. The question remained whether it was a weapon that would save them or destroy them all. The opportunity to leave came a day later. It was delivered by Valerius himself. He appeared in her chamber as if from the shadows, moving with a silent, predatory grace that made her skin crawl. Cassian was in council with Malachi and Seraphina, a tense meeting to address the court's growing panic. Elara was alone. "You are a clever thing," Valerius began, his voice a silken purr. He circled the room, his obsidian eyes taking in every detail, his presence a suffocating miasma of ambition and contempt. "To have ensnared our dying prince so completely. A remarkable feat." "I haven't ensnared anyone," Elara said, her voice tight. She stood her ground near the crystal window, keeping as much distance as possible between them. "Oh, please," he sneered. "Do not play the innocent with me. You are Lyra's get. Deceit is in your blood." He stopped his pacing and turned to face her, his smile as sharp and cold as broken glass. "But your game is over. The court will not tolerate your presence much longer. They will tear you apart, and our prince will be too weak to stop them when they finally act." "He is getting stronger," she countered. "He is experiencing a dead light," Valerius said dismissively. "A final surge before the flame is extinguished forever. When he falls, your protection will be gone. But," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I am prepared to offer you a kindness he will not. A chance to live." He stepped closer, and she fought the urge to recoil. "There is a secret passage from these chambers that leads beyond the citadel walls. I can show it to you. You can walk out of here a free woman, disappear into the human world, and never be troubled by our kind again." It was a tempting offer. Freedom, an escape from the gilded cage, from the hateful eyes and the constant threat of death. For a fleeting moment, she imagined it. A quiet life in a place where no one knew her name or her bloodline. "Why?" she asked, her suspicion overriding her fear. "Why would you help me?" Valerius's smile widened. "Let us call it a gesture of transitional goodwill. With you gone, the prince's false hope will crumble. The curse will claim him as it was always meant to. The court will require new leadership. Strong leadership, unburdened by sentiment and ancient failures. Your disappearance will make for a much cleaner, less bloody succession." The truth of his plan laid bare, cold and ruthless. He did not want to save her. He wanted to use her disappearance to demoralize Cassian and seize power. Her freedom would be the final nail in Cassian's coffin. She would be running away, just as she had been running her whole life, leaving someone else to pay the price. She looked from Valerius's smug, predatory face to the swirling nebula in the window. She thought of Cassian, of the flicker of hope in his eyes, of the shared burden that had forged a bond between them. She thought of his quiet strength, his determination to honor an oath his ancestor had broken. Leaving him now would be the greater betrayal. It would make her no better than Lord Theron. "No," she said, the word solid, unwavering. Valerius's smile faltered. "Do not be a fool, girl. This is your only chance. My place is here," she stated, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised them both. "I will not run. I will see this through with him." She had made her choice. She was no longer a victim fleeing a curse. She was a woman standing to fight one. A flicker of rage crossed Valerius's face, a flash of the true monster beneath the silken facade. "Then you will die with him," he hissed, his voice losing its purr and gaining a venomous edge. He turned and vanished back into the shadows as silently as he had appeared, leaving a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the stone around her. When Cassian returned, she told him everything. He listened in silence, his expression grim, his jaw tight. When she finished, he looked at her, his storm-gray eyes filled with a fierce, protective light. "You chose to stay," he said, his voice low with emotion. "Knowing what he plans, knowing what they want to do to you, you would not have run," she replied simply. "So neither will I." In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted forever. She was no longer just the key to his survival. He was no longer just her protector. They were allies, partners in a war against a shared darkness, surrounded by enemies and bound by a reforged promise. The final battle was coming. They both knew it, and they would face it together. The attack came not with a warning, but with a tremor, a deep, grinding shudder that ran through the very bones of the citadel. Elara was jolted from a light, uneasy sleep. Cassian was instantly on his feet, his body tense, his hand already on the hilt of a sword that had leaned against his bedchamber wall for 100 years. The silver inlays on the chamber doors flared violently, then died, plunging the room into the dim light of the cosmic window. "The outer wards have been breached," Cassian said, his voice a low growl. "But the attack is not from outside." A moment later, the heavy doors to his chambers splintered inward, blasted from their hinges by a shockwave of raw, dark magic. Valerius stood in the ruined doorway, flanked by a dozen nobles, their eyes glowing with red fervor. Their faces were twisted with a mixture of fear and righteous fury. They were not just staging a coup. They believed they were performing a sacred, necessary act of purification. "The time for madness is over, Cassian," Valerius announced, his voice echoing in the chamber. He held a black, crystalline orb in his hand, the source of the magic that had shattered the doors. It pulsed with a malevolent energy, stolen from the depths of the citadel. "The court has decided. The witch dies, the curse is appeased, and the obsidian throne will have a true king again." Cassian pushed Elara behind him, shielding her with his body. He drew his sword, the ancient steel singing as it left the scabbard. He looked stronger than Elara had ever seen him, his body suffused with the life she had been channeling into him for weeks. But he was 1 against 13. "You are fools," Cassian snarled. "You do not appease a curse by feeding it. You are trying to douse a fire with oil. We are lancing a wound," one of the nobles shouted, brandishing his own blade. "For the good of us all." Before the noble could charge, a blur of motion erupted from the corridor behind the traitors. Seraphina, her face a mask of cold rage, moved like a phantom of vengeance. Her twin blades were silver streaks in the dim light. She dispatched 2 of the rearguard nobles before they even realized she was there. Not with killing blows, but with precise, disabling strikes to their limbs and joints. They crumpled to the ground, howling in pain. "For the prince!" she roared, her voice ringing with a loyalty so absolute it was terrifying. She engaged 2 more rebels, her swords a whirlwind of silver death. Valerius sneered, unfazed by the captain's arrival. Loyal to the last. A pity she must fall with her master. He gestured with the orb, and 2 of his largest followers charged past the dueling Seraphina, their eyes locked on Cassian. Cassian met them. He did not move with the frantic energy of a desperate man, but with the terrifying economy of a master warrior. The curse had sapped his strength for a century, but it had not touched his skill. He parried a clumsy swing from the first vampire, the force of the blow jarring the attacker's arm. He spun inside the man's guard, the pommel of his sword slamming into the traitor's temple with a sickening crunch. The vampire dropped like a stone. The second attacker hesitated, his eyes wide with a fear he had not anticipated. He had expected a dying prince, not this lethal apparition. That hesitation was his undoing. Cassian's blade flashed, a precise, upward slash that severed the tendons in the man's sword arm. He screamed, his weapon clattering to the floor. Cassian disarmed him with a contemptuous kick. He showed a chilling restraint, disabling his enemies rather than killing them, proving he was not the monster they claimed him to be. He was a king putting down a rebellion. As the sounds of battle filled the chamber, a new, more insidious attack began. Elara cried out, clutching her head. The curse, agitated by the violence and the raw magic Valerius was wielding, was surging within her. It was no longer a phantom sickness. It was a conscious entity, a voice of pure despair whispering in her mind. They are all the same. They betray. They always betray. Let them burn. Let them all burn. The spirit of Lyra, twisted by centuries of grief, was trying to possess her. She felt a cold, intoxicating power welling up inside her, begging to be unleashed. Her vision swam, the fighting figures becoming indistinct shapes of shadow and light. She saw not Cassian and his rebels, but Lyra's betrayers and the witch hunters who had burned her world. The urge to lash out, to destroy them all with the life-giving magic now curdled into a weapon, was overwhelming. No, she thought, her own consciousness a tiny flicker against the raging inferno of Lyra's ancient pain. This is not my fight. This is not my rage. She focused past the hatred, digging deeper into the heart of the curse. She remembered the visions, the shared memories. The curse was not just about hate. It was about a broken promise. It was the shriek of a shattered oath. It wasn't a separate entity to be fought. It was a wound to be healed. Instead of pushing back against the torrent of vengeful energy, she did the opposite. She opened herself to it, not to be consumed, but to understand. She let the pain, the grief, the betrayal wash through her. And in its depths, she found the source. Not just Lyra's sorrow, but the echo of Theron's shame. The curse was feeding on both. It was a cycle of inherited guilt and inherited pain. The oath was broken. She sent the thought into the heart of the storm within her. But it can be mended. The debt can be paid. As Cassian and Seraphina fought back to back, holding off the remaining traitors, Valerius watched Elara, a triumphant smirk on his face. He saw her writhing, her eyes closed, and assumed his plan was working. He believed the curse was consuming her, that she would explode in a wave of destructive magic that would kill everyone, leaving him to rise from the ashes. "Yes," he hissed, raising the dark orb. "Fulfill your purpose, which be our salvation." But the energy radiating from Elara was changing. The chaotic, hateful aura was coalescing, purifying. The silver spiral on her wrist began to glow, not with a faint light, but with the brilliance of a newly forged star. She opened her eyes, and they were no longer brown, but shining pools of pure silver. She had not been consumed by the curse. She had mastered it. The promise was to protect, she said, her voice layered with her own and the faint, echoing whisper of her ancestor. Not to destroy. Valerius stared, his victory turning to ash in his mouth. This was not what was supposed to happen. She was supposed to be a bomb, not a beacon. Enraged and desperate, he abandoned his pretense of controlling the curse and turned his full attention to the most immediate threat. He snarled and lunged, not at Cassian, but at Elara, a shard of obsidian clutched in his fist. If he could not use her, he would kill her. He never reached her. The weeping black ichor on the walls, the physical manifestation of the curse's agitation, suddenly sprang to life. Tendrils of living shadow lashed out from the stone, not at Elara, but at Valerius. The curse, in the moment of clarity Elara had provided, recognized him for what he was. Not a worshipper, but a parasite, a source of base, greedy ambition that only fueled the cycle of pain. It turned on him with the fury of a betrayed god. The shadow tendrils wrapped around his limbs, his torso, his throat. He screamed, a high, terrified sound that was cut short as a tendril covered his mouth. The dark orb fell from his grasp and shattered on the floor, its stolen power dissipating with a mournful sigh. The remaining rebels froze, their weapons forgotten, as they watched their leader being consumed by the very power he had sought to manipulate. The shadows dragged Valerius back, pulling him into the wall itself. The stone seemed to turn liquid for a moment, swallowing him whole. Then it solidified, leaving no trace that he had ever been there. The black ichor receded. The unnatural chill in the room vanished. The writhing shadows in the corners stilled. In the sudden, shocking silence, the few remaining traitors dropped their swords, their faces pale with terror and awe. They fell to their knees, their rebellion broken not by a prince's sword, but by a power far older and more terrible than they could comprehend. The battle was over. The immediate aftermath was a deafening silence. The surrendered nobles knelt amidst the debris of the chamber, their heads bowed in shame and terror. Seraphina stood panting, her blades dripping with dark blood, her eyes fixed on Elara with a new, profound respect. Cassian, his sword held loosely at his side, looked from the wall that had consumed his rival to the woman standing at the center of it all. Elara's inner light receded, the silver glow fading from her eyes and her mark. The immense power retreated, leaving her swaying on her feet, utterly drained. Cassian was at her side in an instant, his arm around her, supporting her before she could fall. She sagged against him, the strength that had faced down a godlike curse leaving her as quickly as it had come. "It's over," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Yes," he said, his own voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. He held her close, a gesture of pure, unthinking protection. In that moment, surrounded by the ruin of his home and the remnants of his treacherous court, He felt no anger, only a vast, aching relief. He looked down at her, her head resting against his chest, and understood the depth of his folly. He had seen her as a key, a tool to break his curse. He had been wrong. She was the one who had inherited the honor his own ancestor had thrown away. He looked up at his kneeling subjects. "Seraphina," he commanded, his voice regaining its royal timbre. "Take them to the cells. All of them. They will await my judgment." Seraphina nodded, her expression grim. "My lord." She began to herd the defeated vampires out of the chamber, her authority unquestioned. Once they were alone, Cassian guided Elara to the edge of the bed and sat beside her. For a long moment, they simply breathed, the silence a balm after the chaos. The curse was not gone. He could still feel its faint, dormant presence within him, but its malevolence was gone. It was no longer a hungry predator. It was just a scar, an old wound that could finally begin to heal. "My ancestor, Lord Theron," Cassian began, his voice quiet, confessional. He did not just stand aside. He made a pact with the witch hunters. He traded the location of Lyra's village for a promise that they would not trouble his own borders. The admission was a physical pain, a final exorcism of his family's deepest shame. The curse was not revenge. It was justice. A debt of blood for a debt of betrayal. Elara looked up at him, her heart aching for the centuries of suffering he had endured for a sin that was not his. "The debt is paid," she said softly. "You kept the promise. You protected her line. You protected me." He met her gaze, and the last of the walls around his heart crumbled. "You have freed me, Elara, not just from the curse, but from the shame. You have reminded me what honor is." He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. His touch was no longer cold marble, but held a faint, living warmth. "You have changed everything." The next day, Cassian convened the entire obsidian court in the throne room. The chamber had been cleared of debris, but the scars of the battle remained. A scorch mark on the floor, a crack in a pillar. They were reminders of how close they had come to ruin. The nobles who had followed Valerius knelt in chains before the dais, while the rest of the court stood in tense, fearful silence. They did not know what to expect. Justice, by their ancient laws, would be swift and brutal. Cassian entered the hall not alone, but with Elara at his side. She wore a simple, dark gown provided by Seraphina, and she held her head high. She was not his prisoner or his key. She was his ally. A murmur went through the court as they took their places by the throne. Cassian did not sit. He stood before it, a king addressing his people directly. "For 500 years, this court has lived in the shadow of a lie," he began, his voice ringing with a power no one had heard from him in their lifetime. "We told ourselves we were the victims of a hateful witch. We were wrong. We were the heirs of a faithless promise. The curse that has plagued my line and weakened this court was not an attack. It was a consequence. It was a debt, coming due." He recounted the full story of Theron's betrayal, holding nothing back. He spoke of the broken oath, the burning village, the righteous anger that had forged their doom. A wave of shock and shame rippled through the assembled vampires. They were a people who prized honor and the sanctity of oaths above all else. To learn their entire modern history was founded on such a profound dishonor was a devastating blow. "Yesterday," Cassian continued, his voice softening as he gestured to Elara, "that debt was paid." Elara of Lyra's line stood against the echoes of that ancient pain and chose not vengeance, but mercy. She did not break the cycle. She healed it. She did what none of us could. She upheld an oath that my own blood betrayed. He then turned his attention to the kneeling traitors. "Our laws demand your lives for this treason," he said, his voice turning to ice. "You allowed fear to be twisted into hatred by a man who sought only power. You raised arms against your prince and would have murdered an innocent woman to serve your own terror." He let the words hang in the air, the weight of their sentence settling upon them. Then he did the unthinkable. "But the age of blood paying for blood is over. It is that cycle of vengeance that has kept us in darkness for half a millennium." He looked at Elara, a silent communication passing between them. Our new order begins today. It will be founded not on retribution, but on responsibility. He decreed that the traitors would not be executed. Instead, they would be sentenced to service, rebuilding the wards they had helped shatter, reinforcing the citadel's defenses, their lives forfeit to protecting the very court they had tried to usurp. It was a sentence of life, not death, a chance to redeem their honor. Finally, he delivered his most game-changing decree. Elara of Lyra's line is to be named the first emissary of the Obsidian Court. She is no longer human, but our honored guest, a bridge between the long-forgotten past and our new future. Her word will carry my authority. Her safety is the court's highest priority. The oath between our lines is hereby reforged, not as a chain of guilt, but as a bond of alliance. We will no longer hide in the shadows, nursing our ancient wounds. We will honor our promises, he finished speaking. The silence in the hall was absolute. Then Lord Malachi, the pragmatist, the skeptic, stepped forward. He looked at his revitalized prince, and at the human woman who stood beside him not as a weakness, but as a symbol of a newfound strength. He went to one knee, bowing his head in a gesture of profound, uncoerced fealty. "Long live the prince," he said, his voice filled with renewed conviction. "And long live the emissary." One by one, the rest of the court knelt. The hostile stares were gone, replaced by looks of awe and respect. They knelt before their prince, reborn from the ashes of his curse, and before the woman who had saved them from themselves. They were not just submitting to a new order. They were embracing a new hope. A month later, the Obsidian Court was transformed. The weeping ichor was gone, the stones clean and dry. By Elara's request, enchanted crystals that mimicked moonlight were installed in some of the upper corridors, chasing away the deepest shadows. The oppressive atmosphere of dread had lifted, replaced by a quiet, industrious sense of purpose. It was still a place of predators and ancient darkness, but it was no longer a tomb. Elara stood in the Grand Library, a room she had insisted on reopening after decades of disuse. She was not alone. A small group of younger vampires sat before her, their expressions a mixture of fascination and deep concentration. She was teaching them, not magic but history, the true history of their people and hers, speaking of the time of the alliance, of shared respect, of the balance that had been broken. She was replanting the seeds of a forgotten truth. From the doorway, Cassian watched, a faint, genuine smile on his lips. The last traces of the curse were gone from his features. He looked vital, his storm-gray eyes clear and focused. The weight of centuries had been lifted, not just from his body, but from his soul. He was no longer just a warden of a dying kingdom. He was the architect of a new one. Later, they stood together on the high balcony adjoining his chambers, the same one where she had once felt like a prisoner. The swirling nebula of the enchanted window was gone, replaced by a view of the real world. A vast, moonlit forest spread out below them, the silver light touching the tops of the trees. The air was crisp and clean. "Malachi tells me the court is calling you the Oathkeeper," Cassian said, his voice a low, pleasant murmur beside her. Elara leaned against the stone balustrade. "And they call you the Uncursed Prince." "I think I prefer mine," he chuckled, a sound she was coming to love. "As do I." He grew serious, his gaze sweeping over the moon-drenched landscape. "For the first time in my life, I am looking at the future, not just enduring the present." He turned to her, his expression soft. "And it is because of you." Their relationship had settled into a deep, unspoken partnership. It was a bond of profound loyalty and mutual respect, with the delicate, nascent tension of something more stirring just beneath the surface. He was her protector, and she was his conscience, his anchor to a world he was slowly learning to re-engage with. "We did it together," she corrected him softly, her hand finding his on the cold stone. She no longer needed to touch him to keep the curse at bay, but she did so now out of simple, unthinking connection. His hand closed around hers, his skin warm and alive. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the moon trace its path across the sky. The silence of ages had finally been broken, not by a scream of vengeance or a cry of despair, but by a shared, quiet promise. The curse was not vanquished by an act of sacrifice, but by an act of honor. Finally, the silent prince had found his voice, and his kingdom was learning, at long last, how to listen.